Before starting to weather the ship, it's important that you seal it in with a coat of clear gloss acrylic varnish. It must be an acrylic varnish because weathering paints are typically oil-based. Today I'll be using two paints from AK Interactive, AK13 Rust Streaks and AK306 Salt Streaks. I'm not going to be going for a heavy weathered effect, but I do want to have some discoloration in certain parts of the hull, something to give the hull a bit more texture and to break it up from being a single monotonous and very uniform color. One thing to be aware of when applying weathering to a model that you're going to spray over with a matte coat, which will be the case with this ship, is that when you spray it over with a matte coat, it will lighten the effect. This does mean that whatever you put down at this stage will become more difficult to see. So with that in mind, you can be assured that whatever you put down at this stage will be the most visible that it will be. Once sprayed with the matte coat and everything is sealed in with that final layer, it will be a lot more toned down. So if you are going for a heavy weathered effect and you do want this to really show through, even once you've done that final coat with the matte coat, just bear that in mind. You're going to have to put on quite a lot, I think. But in this case, I don't want it to be heavily weathered, but I do want to have a little bit of rusting effects and salt effects throughout the hull. This is a very simple process. It's just a matter of using a fine brush to put down a small drop of paint in the location where you want to streak it from. You then take a brush and you dip it in an appropriate solvent. I'm using Mr. Weathering Color 110. I like it because it is odorless. Then dab the brush on a paper towel to remove the excess solvent, and then use the brush to streak the paint that you've applied to the model. On a gloss surface, it is very easy to remove the paint, so if you do put on too much, just wipe it off and start again. If you're applying weathering effects on top of a clear varnish, it's very easy to correct mistakes. You just need to wet a cloth in the solvent and you can effectively wipe off whatever you've put on the model. So you can experiment a bit with this. It's only going to be locked in once you spray over it with another layer of varnish. Even after this paint has fully dried on the model, you can still come back and correct it just by re-wetting it with some solvent. When doing weathering, you do need to take into consideration the order in which you are applying the effects. For this model, I'm starting with rust because rust would be at the lowest level. Obviously, rust forms in the metal underneath the layers of paint, so you'd expect dirt and salt and shadows and light to all be layered on top of rust. Obviously, it would be a bit odd if you put on rust last. Not sure how often people will find rust lying on top of a shadow, but this is really just a common sense sort of thing. But having said that, and although there is a common sense order in which to apply the effects, that doesn't mean you can't come back later and apply more if you need to. Just in general, I would put rust at the very bottom and then build on top of that. Since at this point the hull and the decks are all sealed in with clear varnish, I'm also going to take the opportunity to apply some rust and salt effects to the deck. Since everything is prepared, I might as well do it at this point. Having everything open, not a lot of superstructure in the way, does make this just that little bit easier, but it's not truly necessary at this point. The primary reason why I'm doing weathering now is so that I can finish everything below the deck and not have to worry about flipping the ship over to work on details below the hull. This will just help protect the superstructure. Ideally, once the superstructure and all those delicate components are installed on the deck, you don't flip the ship upside down. This is also going to be the first indication of how the ship is going to look when completed, because, well, at least everything below the deck will be, in effect, completed by the end of this process. Now that I'm happy with the rust streaks, I can move on to the salt streaks. If after completing the rust streaks, you really like how they look and you don't want to affect them with the salt streaks, then you'll need to seal them in with a layer of clear varnish. But I don't mind the salt streaks and rust streaks mixing, so I don't bother with that. I just apply salt streaks on top of the rust streaks. Well, I generally try to avoid the rust streaks, but if some does get on top of a rust streak and they mix a little bit, that doesn't really bother me. One point to note about the salt streaks is that they are going to be very subtle. I found that the very subtle white becomes very difficult to see underneath a matte coat. So I do put on considerably more dots of salt streaks than rust streaks. I'm using it more as a very subtle effect to break up that homogeneous color of the side of the hull. At this point, you'll notice that I'm only focusing on the area above the waterline. That is because the effects below the waterline and above the waterline are going to be slightly different. Above the waterline, gravity is going to pull water down and create streaking effects. Below the waterline, with it interacting with the ocean, there's going to be more of a mottled effect. I don't want to have lines streaking below the hull. That would only make sense if the ship was being modeled as if it was sitting in a dry dock. In this case, I'm not building a diorama, so I suppose there is quite a bit of flexibility as to how I actually choose to apply the effects. But in this case, I'm going to go for a mottled effect below the waterline, so all these effects that I'm applying now only need to be visible above the boot topping. If any of the paint from the effects is pulled down below the boot top, I wipe it clean. After blending in all the salt streaks, you can already see that they are very subtle. And once again, just remember that this is going to become even more subtle once I apply the matte varnish. Once happy with the state of the hull above the waterline, I move on to applying the effects to the hull below the waterline. In this case, I'm going to just create a very simple mottled effect. I just want there to be a slight variation in the color. To create this effect, I take Mr. Weathering Color WC1, this is just black panel line, and I heavily dilute it with Mr. Weathering Color Solvent 110. This creates a very thin wash that I then apply directly onto the model with a paintbrush. If I get it on too thick, I can always wipe it down. This is a very quick and easy process to follow and completely safe, provided the model is sealed with an acrylic clear coat. If this is sealed with an enamel-based or oil-based clear coat, this will lift off that paint and ruin the model. So I really need to just drive that point home. If you want to replicate this process on one of your models, make sure that you use an acrylic varnish and not an enamel varnish. The last thing I'm going to do before sealing all of these effects in with another coat of clear varnish is to paint the portholes. The portholes need to be filled with black paint. I found the easiest way to do this is to use black panel line. Using panel line is far easier than using paint. With paint, you would need to actually completely paint the circle on the interior of the porthole. But with panel line, you just need to pick it up with a very fine brush, touch the center of the porthole, and let capillary reaction fill up that porthole with black panel line. The solvent in the panel line will then evaporate off and leave a perfectly painted porthole. I want to paint and seal in the portholes at this point because the next round of weathering that I'm going to be doing is applying panel line, and the panel line itself will interact with the portholes. So any effects that I apply to the panel line around the portholes, I don't want it to remove the color for the interior of the porthole, which should just be black. After painting all of the portholes, I then seal in all of these effects by spraying the model in yet another layer of clear acrylic gloss varnish. In the next video, I'll continue the weathering by applying panel line and doing some highlighting. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.